That evening, I was in the kitchen, setting the table. The scent of fried chicken breasts and freshly cooked potatoes filled the air, while the sounds of light chatter filled the space. It was a typical evening at our house. Tom and I had been married for several years, and I thought I knew everything about our cozy, predictable rhythm. But then he showed up. Jake. Tom's friend, the one I always considered just that, a friend. I had no idea that his presence would shift the atmosphere so drastically. I could feel his gaze on me, and when I accidentally met his eyes, something in my chest tightened. It was strange. He looked as though he had no idea what he was doing. Suddenly, everything about our usual life felt alien for a moment. I tried to shake the feeling off, but it lingered. As he laughed and shared jokes with Tom, I found myself stealing glances at him, confused and unsettled. He was younger than Tom and me, always upbeat, always full of energy, but there was something else too, a magnetic confidence. It felt like he wasn't just part of the conversation anymore, he was part of something bigger, something unspoken. And I couldn't ignore it. I continued to go about my evening, setting the plates, bringing out the food, but every time I looked up, I found myself meeting his eyes again, and every time that strange feeling returned. It was as if something was quietly shifting between us, without words. I couldn't figure it out, but it was there, in the space between us, and I couldn't shake the sense that my life, our life, was on the brink of something I hadn't expected. I tried to avoid looking at him, but I could feel his eyes following every move I made. Jake was the life of the party, effortlessly charming, a few years younger than both Tom and me, exuding a carefree confidence that seemed to pull everyone in. He wasn't the kind of person I could flirt with, not that I ever would, but the way he looked at me, the way he spoke, everything about him seemed to pull me in, despite my best efforts to resist. It wasn't like I was attracted to him in any obvious way. I didn't have a crush, I wasn't looking for anything else. But there was something about him that unsettled me. It wasn't just the way he smiled or laughed. It was something deeper, a kind of energy that wrapped around me, one I didn't know how to interpret. I caught his gaze again across the room, and for a brief second, the world seemed to pause. His eyes didn't look away. I had to look away first. My heart raced in a way it shouldn't have, a flutter I couldn't explain. Tom was busy talking to someone else, unaware of the subtle shift that was happening right in front of him. And yet, the tension between Jake and me was so palpable, it felt like it was almost visible. My skin seemed to prickle with an electric charge every time he came near. I told myself to ignore it, to keep things normal, to stay focused on Tom, but the more I tried to push it away, the more it seemed to pull me back in. It was silly. I had to be imagining things. Jake was just Tom's friend. That was it. But deep down, I knew I wasn't imagining it. The air was thick with something unsaid, something that felt as inevitable as it was dangerous. I needed a moment to breathe. The kitchen had become too crowded, too warm. I stepped out onto the balcony, holding a glass of wine in my hand, feeling the cool night air wash over me, calming the tightness in my chest. I told myself I was just tired, just overwhelmed by the noise and the energy. I had to remind myself of who I was, a wife, someone grounded in a life I'd built with Tom. But then I felt it, that presence. Jake was standing beside me, his silhouette framed by the soft light of the kitchen behind him. I hadn't heard him come out. It was like he had just materialized there without making a sound. "You look a little off?" he said with a smile, his voice warm and low, teasing in a way that felt too familiar. I forced a smile, trying to play it off. "I'm just tired," I said, taking a sip of my wine, the glass cold against my fingers. But he wasn't convinced. His eyes studied me too sharply, like he was seeing right through the words I had just spoken. "You're not tired," he said, his voice softer now, almost a whisper. "It's something else." I laughed lightly, hoping to brush it off. "I don't know what you mean." Jake didn't smile. His eyes stayed locked on mine, searching, analyzing. "It's like you're somewhere else," he said, his tone serious now. Like there's something you're holding back. I wanted to say something, to deny it, to laugh it off again. But I couldn't. His words felt too close to the truth. There was something I was holding back. Something I didn't understand, but that felt so strong and undeniable now. I tried to pull myself together, to regain control of the conversation, but it was like trying to hold on to water slipping through my fingers. He took a step closer, and the space between us seemed to shrink with each passing second. I could feel the heat of his presence, his gaze still fixed on me. It was as if he was daring me to admit something I wasn't ready to face. "I'm fine," I said, though my voice wavered slightly. But he wasn't buying it. He didn't need me to say anything more. His eyes told me he already knew. And in that moment, I realized that no matter how hard I tried to convince myself otherwise, there was no going back. The connection between us had already been made, and it was impossible to deny it any longer. A few days passed, but the tension remained. It lingered in the spaces between words, in the silences that stretched too long. I couldn't stop thinking about that moment on the balcony, his words, the way they pierced right through me. I kept trying to convince myself that it was just a fluke, that I could push it all aside. But Jake's presence kept creeping into my thoughts, and the more I tried to avoid him, the more my mind seemed to draw me back. It wasn't until he showed up at the house again that I knew there was no escaping it. "He came by to help with the car," he said. I knew better. There was always something more behind his visits, something unspoken that neither of us could ignore. The house was quiet when he arrived, and Tom was busy in the other room. Jake moved through the space with an easy, familiar confidence, and I couldn't help but notice how he seemed so at ease in my home. He was fixing something under the hood of the car, and I stood by the kitchen window, watching him through the glass. There was something magnetic about the way he moved, the way his hands worked with such precision. I should have gone back inside, kept busy, but my feet wouldn't move. My body felt anchored to that spot, drawn to him in a way I didn't understand. He caught my gaze, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. The air between us felt thick, heavy, as though it was charged with an electric current. He didn't break the silence. He just watched me. And in that moment, I couldn't look away. Finally, he stood up and wiped his hands on a rag, stepping toward the door. "Everything's good," he said casually, but his voice was different now, quieter, like he knew that something had shifted between us. I nodded, forcing myself to smile. "Thanks for helping." Jake stood in the doorway, his eyes never leaving mine. And then, without a word, he reached out, his hand brushing against mine as he passed. The touch was so light, so subtle, but it felt like a jolt of electricity running through my body. I froze, my heart racing. I pulled my hand back quickly, but it was too late. He'd felt it too. I saw the flicker of recognition in his eyes, and just like that, the line had been crossed. Neither of us said anything. There didn't need to be words. We both knew that what had just happened couldn't be undone. I stood there in the kitchen, my breath shallow, and I could hear the sound of my pulse in my ears. Everything around me felt distant, like the world had blurred into the background. The only thing I could focus on was the pull between us, undeniable, relentless. I tried to pretend it didn't matter, but deep down, I knew that nothing would ever be the same again. I tried to go back to my normal life, to pretend like nothing had changed. I went through the motions, cooking dinner, talking to Tom, making small talk with friends, even laughing at the right moments. But no matter how hard I tried to settle back into my routine, there was a constant undercurrent I couldn't escape. It was in the way I looked at Tom, how everything felt slightly off, as if the world was being viewed through a foggy window. Jake's presence lingered. Every time I was with Tom, I could feel it, an unspoken weight in the air. It wasn't just that I couldn't stop thinking about him. It was the way everything seemed to have changed. Even the simplest moments felt tainted. I caught myself staring off into space, wondering what Jake was doing, or remembering the way his hand brushed mine so lightly, but with a force that left me shaken. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, just a fleeting moment of weakness. But I knew it was more than that. I avoided Jake for a while. When I saw his name on my phone, I'd ignore his messages. When he came by to visit Tom, I found excuses to stay out of the house. But it only made things worse. The more I distanced myself, the stronger the pull became. It was as if I were trying to run away from something that was chasing me, and the harder I ran, the faster it seemed to catch up. Then, one evening, I found myself alone at the house. Tom had gone out with some friends, and I was left to myself. My mind kept circling back to Jake, and the quiet moments when I couldn't stop thinking about him. I knew I should ignore the feeling, but it felt too strong, too real to just dismiss. I heard the doorbell ring, and I knew instantly who it was. No one else ever came over unannounced. It was Jake. I froze for a moment, standing in the hallway, my heart racing. I should have turned him away. I should have told him I wasn't in the mood to see anyone. But instead, I walked to the door and opened it. Jake was standing there, a half smile playing on his lips, like he knew exactly what he was doing. "I know you're avoiding me," he said, the words simple but heavy with meaning. "But I thought we should talk." I didn't know how to respond. I wanted to tell him to leave, to tell him I didn't want this, that I had to stop this before it went too far, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I stepped aside and let him in. There was something about the way he stood there, so confident, so sure of himself. It felt like there was no way out anymore. "I think we both know this isn't just about avoiding each other," Jake said, his voice low, filled with a certainty that both frightened and thrilled me. He took a step closer, and I felt the familiar pull again, like gravity was shifting beneath my feet. I wanted to run, to turn and walk away, but my body wouldn't let me. I stood frozen, feeling his presence wrapping around me, filling the space. I couldn't go back now. I could feel the inevitable in the air. Every encounter with him felt like a slow unraveling, like the world I had known was slipping through my fingers. The tension had reached a point where it was impossible to ignore. It was no longer just about stolen glances or light touches. It had become something far more consuming, far more dangerous. That night, when Jake came over, there was no more pretending. We exchanged a few words at the door, but the silence between us was suffocating. Neither of us could deny it any longer. I could see it in his eyes, the same hunger, the same desire that I had been trying so hard to suppress. The moment he stepped inside, the air between us thickened, charged with a raw energy neither of us could resist. We didn't talk much. It wasn't necessary. We had already crossed the line, and everything after that felt like a continuation of something we had both been fighting for weeks. He closed the door behind him, and I didn't move. I couldn't. I was rooted to the spot, drawn to him by something I couldn't explain. He reached for me, his hand brushing mine again, and this time, there was no hesitation. I didn't pull away. He stepped closer, his breath warm against my skin. "I told you," he murmured, "this isn't something we can ignore." I wanted to say something, to stop this madness, to push him away and remind myself of who I was, of who I had promised to be. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, I reached for him, and in that instant, everything else ceased to exist. The kiss was hesitant at first, like we were both testing the waters, unsure if we could handle what we were about to do. But once it deepened, once we both gave in to the inevitable, it was no longer hesitant. It was wild, desperate, like we had been holding our breath for too long and could no longer wait for it to be released. I could feel his hands on me, his touch as urgent as my own. We stumbled toward the living room, too caught up in the moment to care about anything else. The walls between us, the unspoken rules I had lived by, all shattered in that instant. There was no going back now. We were too far gone. When we finally pulled apart, gasping for breath, neither of us spoke. We didn't need to. We both knew what had just happened. The silence that followed was thick with unspoken understanding. But there was no turning back. The path we were on was clear now, and I knew that no matter how hard I tried, I wouldn't be able to stop. Neither of us could. Jake's gaze met mine, and in that moment, I understood. This wasn't something we could walk away from. Not anymore. "I won't stop," he whispered, his voice a promise and a challenge. Neither would I. Each day now felt like a slow electric current running through me. I could feel it in every conversation with Tom, in every smile I forced, in every gesture that was supposed to be casual but felt like a lie. The game we had started, the one I had tried so hard to deny, had become something much bigger than I could have ever anticipated. When I was with Tom, there was this constant ache in my chest. The moments when we laughed together, when we held hands, felt hollow. I tried to enjoy them, tried to convince myself that everything was still the same, but it wasn't. Not anymore. Jake's presence was never far away, a constant shadow in my thoughts. I couldn't stop thinking about him, the way his touch made everything else feel insignificant, the way he had somehow crawled into my every waking moment. It was like living in two worlds. One was with Tom, the man I had vowed to spend my life with, and the other was with Jake, whose very name seemed to set something inside me on fire. I couldn't control the pull anymore. Every time I saw Jake, every time he touched me, I was reminded of how alive I felt. Every time I stepped away, every time I forced myself back into my normal life, it felt like I was suffocating. The worst part was that I knew I couldn't keep pretending. I couldn't go on like this forever. But the temptation, the raw need, was too powerful to ignore. There were times when I'd find myself waiting for Jake's texts, when I'd hear the familiar knock at the door, and my heart would skip a beat. I tried to resist, but every time he came, every time we were alone, I knew what would happen. It had become inevitable. One evening, when Tom was out on a business trip, I found myself alone in the house again. The silence was deafening, but it wasn't the kind of silence that comforted me. It was the kind that echoed with the knowledge of what was to come. My phone buzzed. It was Jake. "Are you alone?" the message read. I stared at it for a moment, heart pounding. I knew what he was asking. I knew what he wanted. And a part of me wanted it too, desperately. I texted back, my fingers trembling as I typed, "Yes." It wasn't long before there was a soft knock on the door. I didn't even hesitate. I opened it, and there he was, standing in the doorway, his gaze intense. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. His presence filled the space, pulling me in like gravity. Without a word, he stepped inside, closing the door behind him. His hand found mine, and the moment our fingers touched, I knew. It was like every other thought in my head vanished, and all that was left was him. The desire, the need, the undeniable connection that had started weeks ago had grown into something unstoppable. "I told you I wouldn't stop," Jake whispered, his lips brushing against my ear as he pulled me closer. And he didn't. Neither of us did. We were caught in this dangerous game now, and it felt like we were sinking deeper with every passing second. There was no escape, no way to undo the damage. We had crossed a line, and it had become too late to go back. I didn't want to go back. The weeks that followed felt like a blur. Each day seemed to blend into the next, with Tom none the wiser to the growing divide between us. I played my part, of course. I laughed when I was supposed to. I asked about his day. I made dinner just as I always had. But inside, I was constantly torn between two worlds. The love I had once felt for Tom seemed distant, like a faded memory, while Jake's presence consumed my every thought, my every waking moment. I couldn't keep up the pretense forever. The guilt that gnawed at me during every quiet moment, every stolen glance, had built to a point where I knew something had to give. I had to face it. I couldn't keep living this lie, but I also knew there was no turning back. What Jake and I had, whatever it was, had become something I couldn't deny. It had taken root in me, and I wasn't sure I wanted to let it go anymore. The truth was, I hadn't wanted to stop. Not really. It had all felt too real, too intense to be ignored. One evening, when the weight of it all had become too much to bear, I found myself sitting at a small, quiet cafe, away from the world, away from everything that had become too complicated. I had told Jake to meet me there. I knew it would be our turning point, the moment when everything would be laid bare. When he walked in, his gaze immediately locked with mine. There was no need for words. I could see it in his eyes, the understanding, the shared awareness that there was no way out of this anymore. He took a seat across from me, and for a moment, we just looked at each other, the weight of everything between us pressing down on us both. "I can't do this anymore," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, but it felt like it shook the air between us. "I can't keep pretending. I can't keep going back and forth, trying to keep things together when it's already broken." Jake's eyes softened, and he leaned forward slightly, his expression serious, yet calm. "I never wanted to hurt you," he said, "but I knew, from the moment we first locked eyes, that there was no way we could walk away from this, not once it started." I swallowed hard, the truth settling in, heavy and undeniable. "I don't want to hurt Tom," I said, my voice trembling slightly. "But I don't know how to stop this. I don't know if I want to." Jake reached across the table, his fingers brushing against mine, and for a moment the entire world seemed to disappear. It was just him and me. "I don't think either of us can stop now," he said softly. "We've crossed the line and it's too late to go back."